The rape of Nanking was committed in the backdrop of the war in China, where Japanese soldiers cited that they were being attacked by Chinese civilians, or soldiers hiding in civilian garb. And that justified the horrific atrocity committed against that city. And the Turkish genocide of Armenians occurred during the extreme insecurity of the First World War, a time in which the British sought to defeat the Ottomans by destroying it from within. So the Turks attempted to destroy who they believed would be a prime candidate to destroy them from within. Now, sadly, it makes little difference whether these accusations are true, because the fear is real. The historian John Dower, his seminal work on race and war, entitled War Without Mercy, argues persuasively that when two sides in war are racially differentiated, the level of atrocity is considerably higher. One of his most telling statistics is that of slightly under 100,000 Americans who were held prisoner of war by the Germans, only roughly 1% of them died in captivity, largely from battle wounds. In the Pacific, Americans held by the Japanese numbered roughly 26,000, and of that, 45% died. Japan was extremely racially aware and defined itself as a distinctly superior race and as a representative of Asian races against Western colonialism. But Dower doesn't stop there. He also illustrates the extreme anti-Asian and actually particularly anti-Japanese racism in the United States prior to the Second World War. There was no subsequent internment of German Americans that mirrored the internment of Japanese Americans. Indeed, the entire American policy of prisoners of war was predicated on the belief that the Japanese would never surrender. And this was because of the Bushido, the way of the warrior. As a result, the United States, and particularly Admiral Chester Nimitz, had a no-prisoner policy, something that never gets reported in the American history texts. And it was effective. It was an effective policy, particularly for the Navy, because since they had engaged in an island-hopping strategy, it required a mobile force, and prisoners would just weigh them down. When the Japanese discovered the American no-prisoner policy, it compelled its commanders to fight to the death of the last soldier, presuming they would die anyway. It's a chicken and egg argument, and one that's beyond my expertise, which of these caused which, but they were certainly mutually reinforcing. And it also reinforced the notion that the Japanese would listen to neither reason nor mercy, and was an extremely important factor in the decision of the United States to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Germany's own racist policies in the East mirror Dower's descriptions in the Pacific. Germany's treatment of its eastern neighbors was considerably worse than its treatment in the West. And it should come as no surprise Germany racially differentiated itself from the East, the Untermensch, as the Germans described them, the Eastern Slavs, in a way that they did not in the West. And so, that is one of many pieces of empirical evidence that suggests that racism in warfare heightens levels of atrocity. It compels individuals to refuse to differentiate between civilian and soldier, which is a fundamental premise behind what we call discrimination in St. Augustine's just war theory. The idea that you choose legitimate military targets and you don't attack civilians. With the very modern policy of total war, in which an entire population is deemed a military target, Augustine's notion of discrimination ceases to have meaning. Racism ensures that we simply look at those slanted eyes, as guilty can be. Replace slanted eyes with rags on their heads or copies of the Quran, and you have the horrifically updated version of the painfully familiar sentiments. Now, the core of my argument is that if security is not provided by some external actor, a state, the international system, etc., humans will provide for it themselves, or at least attempt to. This leads us to the security paradox. Perhaps the most important early modern philosopher influencing my field of international relations is Thomas Hobbes, a 17th century Englishman writing in the midst of that nation's bloody civil war. Hobbes identifies security as the core interest of all persons. His natural man was one who consistently threatened one another and who lived in abject fear for his own life, as well as that of his loved ones. In the absence of a powerful entity to ensure security, we are consigned to a life that is, in his famous phrase, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes' greatest contribution to international relations is his recognition of the security paradox. He writes that under conditions of what he calls the state of nature, the absence of governmental authority, because of our extreme insecurity, we have no choice but to arm ourselves for our defense. But because arms have both offensive and defensive capabilities, and they all do, when one person arms himself, he threatens his neighbors. They will respond by arming themselves, creating a cycle of insecurity. Indeed, the more you try to arm yourself, the less secure you will feel. This is the same logic that creates arms races, a wonderful description as a part of this exhibit, the tragic irony of MAD. The United States and Soviet Union consistently sought to overcome perceptions of insecurity through massive armaments. This led to the perception that peace was kept through the aptly named policy of mutually assured destruction, the acronym MAD. The irony of MAD is that it was based not on rational responses to attack, but instead on the emotional response of anger and vengeance. Remember, mutually assured destruction ensured that if one state attacked the other, so long as there was enough weapons that survived that attack, what we called a second strike capability, they would launch back, both sides would be destroyed, there would be no victors in war. But if a state launched that first strike and destroyed an enemy, the only motivation for the victim state was vengeance. Nothing's going to save that first state's government, its population, or, as we now know, probably the entire planet would be destroyed. See, nuclear planners understood this because they automated the second strike capability, ensuring computers would launch under the guise that if our command and control structure was destroyed, then neither of the two states could launch a second strike. In reality, there was a distinct question as to whether or not a human would launch that second strike when there was no nothing militarily to be gained by it. This is fear rising to the level of complete and utter irrationality, the irony of which mutually assured destruction is described in my field as rational choice. Indeed, those who argue that nuclear weapons were in fact usable were considered to be proponents of what we called nuclear utilization theory. I kid you not, this is real. The acronym of MAD versus nuts. This irrationality led to the waste of billions of dollars of much-needed resources, as well as countless sleepless nights. Personally, I remember being a child of the 80s, occasionally being quite terrified, wondering if I just had enough shovels. I don't know if anybody recognized that. That was the Reagan administration's civil defense policy. With enough shovels, we could survive a nuclear attack. Consider the poignant words of former President Dwight Eisenhower. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies in the final sense a theft from those who are hungry and not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. This world in arms is spending not money alone, it is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hope of its children. And it ensures basic human needs are not met. Hobbes' recommendations to overcome this security was to create a powerful government, to use his own term, a leviathan, who would be charged with maintaining law and order. Sadly, in international relations, states exist not under the guise of a powerful international organization, but under conditions of anarchy. The foundational theory in international relations, what is termed realism, argues there are four conditions in the international system